So I got these Watanabe wheels for pretty cheap, but ends up they were off a Corolla. So when I mounted them on a 510, they were really close to hitting the coilovers. So I needed to rent a spacer. So the specs on these wheels is 14 by 6.5 plus 14.5 millimeter offset. Now looking at Watanabe's catalog, they make a 14 by 6.5 9.5 millimeter offset, and I believe that's a good wheel to use for 510s and using with 280ZX front strut housings, which I have. So I actually bought a pair of wheel spacers, 5 millimeter and 8 millimeter. So right now I'm currently using the 5 millimeter, and it actually has a pretty good clearance between the tire and the coilover perches. But one of my concerns was the lug nuts having a threading, because when I tried to use the lug nuts, it only had a little bit of thread on them. So I ended up searching, and I didn't really want to use longer wheel studs because that would make me have to take the hubs off and press out the studs. It's not hard to do, but I didn't really want to go that route. So I remember seeing in the past, they're called extended shank wheel nuts, and this is what they look like. Okay, they look like this, and they go into the wheel to give more threading. But on these wheels, you have to modify them. So this is another wheel I have here, and if you look at them, they have the conical seat, which is good, just like for a lug nut, so it gets seating. But if you notice it here, it doesn't seat all the way in. So I have to drill them out so that way they seat in more. Right? You see that? So to do this, and I'm going to flip the wheel around, is on the back side here. You notice how it goes in more. Okay, so what works good is just getting a large Dremel bit, and a large Dremel bit bores it out, and since it's stepped, it makes it where you don't drill out too much metal, so that way the shank sits real square. But in doing so, it creates like a little step. So to clean up that step, you could just use a large drill bit of the size of the shank, or use like a grinding bit like you would use for like head porting, and actually will clean up the step real well, and it works really good. So after doing it and doing my measuring, I'm getting at least a minimum of a 1/2 inch of thread, and so calculating or measuring, I'm getting at least about 9 to 10 turns on the lug nuts before I actually even have to use the torque wrench. So that means I'm getting some pretty good thread. So I'm pretty confident that this works out really well. I like the way the wheel sits, and I'm using a 185/60/14 tire. Some people would use like a 185/60/14. I'll give a little bit more clearance, but I'm trying to go get as much meat as I can on for contact, so I'm going this route. And with this height on the car with stock fenders, I believe this is like a really nice setup. So far, it seems pretty good. And another thing that I used as reference was, I have this SSR wheel that's a 14 by 6.5 plus 7 offset. So between this and the Watanabe wheel now, the difference is only like what, 2.5 millimeter offset. So I'm running really close to this SSR wheel, which I've had years, so it works real well. I know there's clearance. I've never had an issue, so I figure I'm pretty good in the ballpark. Now, one thing is, if you notice that these lug nuts are an open end, which isn't bad, because I did this because they were inexpensive for one, and then I was able to measure, so that way I could see how much threading I have to use with, and also if I do decide to go with longer wheel studs, they can protrude out, which isn't a bad thing, so it works out pretty well. Now for the rear, I'm using a 14 by 7.5 -3 offset Watanabe wheel with a 185/60/14 tire. This works good for, I think, stock body or sedans or coupes or wagons. I think this is the max I would go. They actually make a 14x7 plus 3mm offset, which I believe is actually the ideal wheel to go with for if you're running stock fenders, and you could run like a 185 60/14 tire. I'm running a 185 60/14 tire because I need a little bit of stretch for extra clearance, because when I ran the 195s, they were getting really close to, or they would rub. And for sure, I ran a competition tire too, and that for sure rubbed, because when you run a competition tire, they're a little bit more squared off on the sidewall or meaty. So good for contact patch, but got to watch for clearance. So this is where you need to know which wheel you're going to use and which offset. For the rear, I'm running Techno Toy rear leaf springs with the 2-inch blocks, and I'm using shorter stroke KYB shocks for a Suzuki Samurai. Very inexpensive shock to use, and works pretty well. Haven't had an issue so far. It's been a few months. I'm pretty happy with it. Before I was running Tokiko stock body shocks, and it's just when I lowered it with the leaf springs, it definitely changed the mount point. So going with the shorter stroke shock definitely gave me some nice travel. And so far, it's, pretty good. I went for a little cruise around the neighborhood slowly to be safe, to check for clearance, and it's working out. I'm going to try to go for a drive later on to a little bit more, try to push it a little more just to make sure everything's okay. And I'll report back later.